Good afternoon. I'm supposed to deliver my contribution in English. It was written in French, and there's also a version in German. My first language is my mother language, and then French, but coming from Cameroon, we are supposed to be bilingual. I really thank the translator and the interpreter. I received a translated text in English, but I had to review it to make myself understandable in my thinking. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, Your Eminence. We met first 2009 in Rome at the occasion of the Second African Synod. At that time, I was lecturing at the Catholic University in Central Africa, in Yaoundé. Just after the Synod, you invited me to come to Budapest. I couldn't, since I was at the same time Dean of Studies. And you told me that since at that time you were president of the Symposium of the European Episcopal Conferences, your priest thought or were thinking that when you are in Rome, you are just, on vacation. So you need an African who could witness and testify that. That was the case. And afterwards, 1 year after my ordination, 4 years ago, you invited me and to make it sure that I should take part to this International Eucharistic Congress. Thank you. Please, on Holy Thursday, 18 years ago, Pope John Paul II offered to the Word, to the bishops, priests, and deacons, consecrated persons, and all the lay faithful, a beautiful letter, a profound message. Ecclesia, Eucharistia de Ecclesia. It was 2003. We thank God and we are pleased that in this area we can see some of the persons who concelebrated with him, who worked with him, and so on. I can just mention His Excellency Martini. It was at the occasion of Holy Thursday, 25 years ago. We will take advantage of the events who brought us Ecclesia de Eucharistia, Eucharistia de Ecclesia, both. The Eucharist are source and summit fulfillment of all Christian life. When Pope John Paul II commits us to Eucharist in its relationship to the Church, he also recalls for the people of God what the fathers of the Church affirm. The Eucharist builds the Church, and the Church, which celebrates the Eucharist, makes the Eucharist. The features that articulate this teaching of Pope John Paul II are also vectors of a theology of the Eucharist that illustrates the scope and ecclesial practice of the sacrament. The Eucharist as a mystery of the faith, the Eucharist as builder of the Church, the apostolicity of the Eucharist of the Church, the Eucharist and ecclesial communion, the dignity of the Eucharist celebration. I was very pleased to listen to Professor S.E.R. Very important to know that, first, the Eucharist is not a missal, but a source, fonte. Thank you underlying that there's a frame. This frame is given as a codex, a canon, in the Judaic tradition, Toda Rabah. Thank you underlying the link between the Eucharist of daily life. Thank you underlying the diaconia of the Eucharist. I was pleased to listen to you dealing with fonte, la morte del Signore, death and resurrection, coming from the Cameroons, trying to listening to the African cry, what does this mean for us? Sacramentum Caritatis. The decision of Pope Francis to host the International Eucharist Congress in Budapest marks a great ecclesial action in the strength of the Holy Spirit to continue to fill the heart of the whole people of God at an international and universal level with life, love, adoration of the Eucharist, celebrating the mystery of faith. This is the mystery of faith. We proclaim your death, O Lord. We profess your resurrection until you come again. Anamnesis. And do this in memory of me. Yes, dear brothers and sisters, as we know, neither the COVID-19 pandemic nor the serious difficulties related to health security issues, nor the anguish and worries of the nation states justified in view of the effects of this pandemic could prevent us from holding this postponed International Eucharistic Congress. Your Eminence, after years, we are here. Receive our expression, but when I say you, this is all who have been working over years, in the last 4 years, preparing this. I take this opportunity to thank them, bishops, collaborators, members of the clergy, the expert, the lay faithful Christian, the Catholic associations, the religious congregations, all young people involved, and all those volunteers who for years have been preparing this Congress. My presentation is divided into 4 parts that also constitute the milestone of our approach to the subject that has been proposed to us. First, so-called specific features of the Eucharistic celebration, understanding and foundation, how we approach them. That will be the first part. The second part, don't follow the translated text. Follow what I'm saying now. Searching for theological and liturgical roots of the celebration of the Eucharist. Third, aspects and dimensions of the Eucharistic celebration in Africa. And then fourth, and at that place, a corpus, an iconographical corpus with pictures, images, and so on. Since at that time, I'm fearing that some will be sleeping. Don't sleep, please. First, the specific features of the Eucharist celebration, the so-called specificity of the Eucharistic celebration in Africa. Back to the title that has been proposed to us, the specific features of the Eucharistic celebration in Africa, we wish to make some remarks. First, any so-called specific feature of the Eucharistic celebration, wherever it might be, fundamentally finds its form, its structure, and model in the Last Supper. This is Fonte, where Jesus, before his passion and death, instituted this most holy sacrament. The prolegomena to the Passover meal of Jesus and his disciples, and the narratives of the institution of the Eucharist are the basis. Consequently, Pope John Paul II underlines in his encyclica Ecclesia de Eucharistia 2003, the event of Holy Thursday visibly bears features of a liturgical sensitivity modeled on the Old Testament tradition, reshaping itself in the Christian celebration, the link between Old and New Testament, between the Judaic tradition and the Christian tradition, so that in harmony with the new content of the Passover Easter, we can celebrate. Number 47 of Ecclesia de Eucharistia. Pope John Paul II concludes that Christian liturgy was born in the wake of the words and gestures of Jesus, developing the ritual heritage of Judaism, number 48. But breaking and fulfilling this ritual heritage of Judaism, the Christian Eucharist celebrates, quote, the gift that the divine bridegroom continually makes of himself to his bride. It is a sacrifice offered once and for all times on the cross, where the bridegroom, Jesus Christ, becomes food for all his faithful. The celebration form, a banquet, a meal, has his specific mark, namely the shed blood on Golgotha. The convivial dimension of the Eucharistic celebration must therefore assert for this dimension, which is normative, unique, the redemptive scope. Hospitality to every person who thirsts for the bread of eternal life. Therefore, the bread that is broken on our altars, said Pope John Paul II, which is offered to us on pilgrimage as pilgrim working on the path of the word, is panis angelorum, bread of angels, which can only be approached with the humility of the centurion of the gospel. Lord, I am not worthy that you enter under my roof. We therefore understand the nuance that we wish to bring to this title, specific features of the Eucharistic celebration in Africa. Dear brothers and sisters, the Church in Africa does not invent a specific form of celebration that would take shape and take its source elsewhere than in the celebration of the Paschal Mystery, Passover meal, in the Holy Communion on Holy Thursday, the Christian theological and Eucharistic tradition, the Church faith in the Eucharistic mystery. Since we have been acknowledging the canonicity and liturgical normativity of the Eucharist, the argument that justifies this title is to be found in the series of external expressions. The celebration of the Eucharistic assuming various shapes throughout history and cultures of Christian communities. Pope John Paul II notes in his regard, quote, architecture, sculpture, painting, music, by Christian mystery have found in the Eucharist directly or indirectly a motive of great inspiration, number 49, end quote, from Pope John Paul II. So you have to understand that the whole history of the early Christian church, medieval church, modern and contemporary church, illustrate this development in terms of various expression, motifs, and way celebrating the Eucharist in order to turn them towards Christ, to the gospel of salvation. The need for an, underline this, inculturation of the Christian faith is required in all means, including in liturgy, provided that the liturgical norms that guarantee the celebration of the Eucharistic faith professed by all are observed. Pope John Paul II underlines, number 51, during my many pastoral journeys, John Paul II I remember that he came twice to the Cameroon, 1985 and 1995. At that time, he gave and published Ecclesia in Africa, the first so-called document which was signed by the Pope in Africa and not in Rome. And I'm really very moved to see Cardinal Onyekan, one of those synodal fathers who were 94 in Rome and 95 in Yaoundé. Welcome, Your Eminence. I have been able to observe, writes John Paul II, in all regions of the world, the vitality that can be manifested in the Eucharistic celebrations in contact with the forms, styles, and sensibilities of different cultures, not Pope John Paul II. By adapting to the changing conditions of time and space, the Eucharist offers nourishment not only to individuals, but peoples themselves, and it forms cultures inspired by the Christian spirit and faith, unquote. You see, Pope John Paul II noted that what has happened in the lands of old Christianity in matters of sacred art and liturgical discipline is also happening in continents where Christianity is young, inculturation. Since the Second Vatican Council, 1962-1965, the convocation by the popes of first the African Synod 1994, and then the Second African Synod 2009, respectively, have highlighted the great adventure of the Christian mission in Africa, the process of evangelization, and the life of the church on this continent. When arriving this afternoon and joining us, Cardinal Onyekan, you said, in the last 40 years, a lot have been done, issuing those both synods, Ecclesia in Africa and Africae Monos. Though the teaching of its constitution, Sacrosanctum Concilium, Dei Verbum, Lumen Gentium, Gaudium et Spes, through those constitutions, the Christian faith shows that it has to be incarnated in history and cultures in order to transform them in death. Now to the second point, searching for theological and liturgical roots for the celebration of the Eucharist in Africa. It was very important, my dear brothers and sisters, to know that Africa, or celebration of the Eucharist in Africa, doesn't mean to invent. The prolegomena was very important. We have just noted how far the inculturation of the Christian faith in Africa is attested under the impetus of the Second Vatican Council and its teaching, to which must be added Evangelii Nuntiandi from Pope Paul VI, while not forgetting Africae Terrarum from the same Pope who visited Uganda in 1969, to lead to this other impetus from him, exhorting Africans to be their own missionaries. That means taking in account their own cultures. Africains, vous êtes vos propres missionnaires. Africans, you are now your own missionaries. This page in the history of the church in Africa is characterized by a search for pastoral adaptation in the fields of liturgy, catechesis, celebration of the sacraments, linked to the resources of religious and cultural anthropology from African traditions. The theological and pastoral challenge remains beyond the forms of indigenization and formal adaptation. The Christian faith and the liturgical rooting of faith confessed integrally and specially the Christian mystery. This highlights how the contribution of African tradition are important for our musical, choreographic understanding of rites. For example, oral tradition and so on. Therefore, the inculturation of the sequence of certain African Christian liturgies, the rhythms and songs of our choirs, and their choreographies, pictorial and plastic iconography are authentic confessions to salvation in Jesus Christ. They are testimonials of him and proclaim as well the Mirabilia Dei of African communities. In other presentation and publication with other theological contributors, we have been addressing this debate, African traditional contribution to Christianity, the problem of inculturation of the faith in its heritage, in its experiences, and its perspectives. For what we believe, we confess and celebrate in the Eucharist the sacrament of perfect love, sacramentum caritatis. It is a salvation of all humanity. It is the life of God given in Jesus Christ, dead and risen, bread broken for a new word. We are therefore allowed to ask ourselves the question, does Jesus Christ save Africans today? Does Jesus Christ save Africa today? Does Jesus save Africans today? To answer this question, we cannot just simply quote the catechism of writings on Christology or liturgical manuals. Instead, we must take into account the aspiration of humanity and see for ourselves the places and conditions in which Africans live today as outcasts and in need of a daily basis. What areas generate mass immigration, where the dignity of the human person is at stake, where the bread of life and the bread needed for life are lacking. This is the challenge also to Fonte, to the source, which is the Eucharist. We will then also be attentive to the links between Eucharist, the Eucharistic celebration and anamnesis, the Eucharist and mission, the Eucharist and witnessing, testimony, and diaconia, commitment. Do this in memory of me. Give them something to eat. Third part, aspect and dimensions of the Eucharistic celebration in Africa. This is really what I was supposed to deal with. But you understand that the prolegomena is very important. You are not dealing here just with a folkloristic, issue. Celebration in Africa is joyful and so on. I was supposed to answer and to address this point, aspect and dimensions of the Eucharistic celebration in Africa, having already underlined that we have a canon, having underlined that the process of inculturation is not an invention of Africa, but throughout the history of the Church, dealing with what it means, faith in history, culture, and society. Third, since the Second Vatican Council, various episcopal conferences in Africa and Madagascar, and I'm really, allow me that, happy to have John here, since he went throughout this history in the last 40 years. They have expressed concern or the wish for liturgical and Eucharistic celebrations that reflect the expressions of the confessed and lived faith in the Christian community, African communities, thus demonstrating the inculturation of the faith and the liturgy. the long development that led to the so-called le rite zaïrois, or Zaïren Rite, et je me réjouis que le professeur Marini et l'archevêque soient là. Le rite zaïrois testify in a paradigmatic way to a form of African Eucharistic celebration that, beyond the name, is a rite approved by the Roman magisterium and finds its expression in other local and some specific churches where the same rite is practiced. The rite was approved on April 30 by the Congregation of Divine Worship by a decision of Pope John Paul II. It is documented under the name of supplement to the Roman Missal for the Diocese of Zaïre. Le supplément, n'est-ce pas, du missel romain pour les diocèses du Zaïre. Supplément. Where a concise description of the liturgy of the Mass is presented. The genesis and the different aspects of this whole issue are excellently treated in a document which is quoted here. Dear brothers and sisters, the title, The Specific Features of the Eucharistic Celebration in Africa, refers to our effort to incorporate into the Eucharistic celebration of the Roman tradition some significant, some constitutive elements of the African tradition whose diversity, nature, and meaning contribute to promote the liturgical participation, underline this, of the Christian people who celebrate the Eucharist. It also enriches the confessed and celebrated faith of these people of God. Having spent some years during studies in Bonn in Germany, every year I used to go to Speyer, remembering Edith Stein, Theresia Benedicta Cruce, the Eucharistic Congress 1932. This is very important, 1932. Then came 33. 1932, Edith Stein, Sainte Bénédicte, Thérèse Bénédicte de la Croix, she had a contribution at the Congress. We should read it again. Eucharistisches Leben. Eucharistisches Leben. Vivre eucharistiquement. Living eucharistically. 1932, la contribution d'Edith Stein au Congrès eucharistique de Speyer, de S.E.R. So remembering this, we see how important the contribution to liturgy has to be constitutive. So the constituent elements and aspects in African tradition. The religious and cultural anthropology of the peoples of Africa bears witness to a great richness and variety of constituents that mark the entire expression of life, beliefs, practices. Jesuit Father Engelbert Mdong, who was murdered in the Cameroon, was able to characterize such a richness by the expression cosmic liturgy and religious language. Here, various rites are assembled, linked with the divinity and ancestors, initiations and their procedures, forms of meals, dance, choreography, music, and its instruments, drums, balafon, xylophone, stringed instruments. It is this universe that marks Afro-Africans who become disciples through the grace of Christ. The Christian faith and the gospel will transform and enrich these cultural and liturgical constituents. The so-called, again and again, rite zaïrois of the Eucharistic celebration, therefore, includes the following elements. We do have about 12 elements. First, at the beginning of the Mass, the so-called announcement of this great event by an announcer, a herald, This comes from our traditional way. When people gather, there's an announcement. It's an important issue. Second element, comme constituant, the veneration of the altar at the entrance, which in the Eucharistic celebration indicates that Christ himself is at the same time the altar, the victim, and the main celebrant. This is why they have a form of venerating the altar, Christ, l'autel, la victime, et le célébrant. The presentation of the celebrant and all the members who participate humbly, giving their disposition, their agreement humbly to respond to the invitation of God. Fourth, the invocation of the saints and please the ancestors. The saints and the ancestors, whose righteousness only God knows, not all, whose ancestors, so we remain where we request them to intercede on our behalf, thus putting the participants in the liturgy, the participant of earth taking part to the liturgy in heaven. Communio Sanctorum, la participation à la liturgie, n'est-ce pas? Les orthodoxes nous le disent mieux avec la messe de Saint Jean Chrysostome. Fifth, the fifth element, the enthronement of the Word of God, solemnly carried in procession, as you know, venerated before its proclamation. You do have here the tradition of the centrality of the Word in Africa, throughout other cultures, but the word is central, very important. The gestures, but also the oral tradition, they are intended to enrich the liturgy. 6, the blessing of all those who will proclaim this word, not just the deacon, not just the priest who will proclaim the gospel, but all who are proclaiming the first reading, the second reading, they will be blessed. 7th element, the penitential act that occurs after listening to the proclaimed word or after the creed, taking in account that the people of God have to receive, to say amen. And then 8th, the rite of peace. 9, the presentation of offerings and oblates. 10, the Eucharistic prayer and the Eucharistic rite involve elements of dialogue between the celebrant and the faithful, who are thus conducted in the paschal mystery of Christ, who gives himself in this Passover for the life of humanity. Now, we are arriving to this fourth part and last part of my contribution, testimonies and documents dealing with iconography, catechesis, and Eucharistic celebrations in Africa. Thank you. We don't have enough time to consider it, but many of you know this work of the Jesuit father, Engelbert Mbeng. It's very important to consider it closely linked to this International Eucharistic Congress. You recognize 3 colors. Those are the fundamental colors in African hermeneutic of aesthetics. You have black, ebony, resistance. You have the color red, dealing with, referring to sacrifices. And white, in Africa, it's a dimension of afterlife. So when I see you, I'm remembered that there's an afterlife. but we have to check here how it is. Afterlife, 3 fundamental colors: the chromatic, dynamic, and Christ, as you see, his head like a host, and the corpus like a chalice. La tête du Christ, c'est l'hostie, le corps du Christ, c'est le calice. L'Eucharistie intégrale du Père Engelbert Mveng. The beautiful man, the good man, the truth. The Last Supper, life of the Mafa Jesus. The people Mafa lives in the northern Cameroon. 2 weeks ago, I went there in this region of Mokolo, close to Nigeria, to celebrate a Mass at the occasion of the 60th anniversary of Baba Simon Mpeke, who settled there. This is the region, Tokumbere, Mafa. And you see, this is the Last Supper. What do you see? This scene is part of a catechetical pastoral program in this diocese of Marwa. The enculturation of the Eucharist here becomes visible in the red color of Jesus' robe at the Lord's Supper. You see, all the apostles participate with gravity in this Passover meal of the institution of the Eucharist. Can you see Judah? Can you see him? He is the only one who betrayed. The traitor turns his gaze away from Jesus. You can see him in blue. You can see also the musical instruments. It's not organ and so on, it's drums, string instruments. Jesus leaves not a chalice, but what we say, a calabash. The clothing of the participants in the Eucharist emerges from the locality. This is the Last Supper. The scene of washing of the feet, life of Mafa Jesus in the same place, refers to the Eucharist as an act of diaconia, John chapter 13, and shows Jesus and Peter. The crucifixion from the series Life of the Mafa Jesus. Thank you, Professor Sequeri, about La Morte del Signore. This is Fonte. The group at the cross documents the crucified on Golgotha. O crux ave, spes unica. If the grain of wheat fallen into the ground does not die, it remains alone. If it dies, it bears much fruit. The crucified and the Eucharist, the broken bread, the bloodshed for the salvation of the word. And you do have this here in churches, iconographies, you do have here in chasuble and stalls and so on. The Emmaus disciples of Father Engelbert Mveng. The Eucharist after the reading, relecture, Luke 24, of the Word and the events of the passion and death of the Messiah. The Eucharist with the disciples of Emmaus as a celebration of the resurrection. They recognize him in the breaking of the bread. Tout un parcours de la reconnaissance, dirait M. Ricoeur, mais christologiquement. Consider the strong and expressive features on the faces of these two disciples. Wonder, but also gratitude. You have wonder there, you have gratitude here, worshiping. Jesus Christ breaks the bread and by his gesture sends the two disciples back to the Last Supper. He is alive, but in the glory. Fish, bread. The Emmaus disciple in this series of Joseph-Marie. Jesus is not breaking the bread. We'll now not begin with the debate about these issues, de l'Eucharistie du mille. La question est clôturée. But it's important to know that meal in a family, in a community, for us should refer to the Eucharist. Donnez-leur vous-même à manger. The Good Samaritan, do this in memory of me. Voilà la dimension diaconale de l'Eucharistie. The parable of the Good Samaritan invites us to help our neighbor, to serve our neighbor, to consider our neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Pope Francis answers, Fratelli tutti. All my brothers and sisters. Here is an invitation to live and to act eucharistically, eucharistisch leben. Edith Schein, 1932 in Speyer. White Crucifixion, Marc Chagall. So we see what we could consider as interculturation. The Jewish painter Chagall see just at the feet of Christ. It recounts and articulates dramatic and tragic scenes. You know them better in events in the life of the Jewish people in the late 30s. The work is from 1938. Victims of pogroms here under the figure of the Messiah crucified in the prayer shawl. It is significant that the artist painted a large host attached to the menorah of the faith of Israel. Messiah, Christ, Eucharistic offering, host sacrifice. This canvas has a historical political charge, we know, that returns everyone to the task to be accomplished so that the Eucharist, the crucified Messiah, the shed blood, the crucified body, can work in death for salvation, reconciliation, life in fullness. It remains a challenge. Mary, the mother of the Redeemer, Redemptoris Mater. In the last chapter of Ecclesia de Eucharistia, Pope John Paul II speaks from La Femme Eucharistique, La Femme Eucharistique, inviting us to join the School of Mary. Imiter Marie, à l'école de Marie. Inviting Christian and communities celebrating the Eucharist to put themselves in the School of Mary, the Eucharistic Woman. This is Our Lady of Africa. John Paul II notes that Mary's presence could not be absent from the Eucharistic celebrations among the faithful of the first Christian generation, with the apostles, assiduous at the breaking of bread. The Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2. Through her whole life, Mary is a Eucharistic woman, underlines John Paul II. The Church, looking to Mary as her model, is called to imitate her also in her relationship with this most holy sacrament, number 53. You recognize the adulterous woman, the life of the Martha Jesus, and the parable of the prodigal son as well. L'Eucharistie est le pardon. L'Eucharistie est la réconciliation. Thank you.